Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for having me again to this conference. I'm really happy to be engaging again with this audience. So I was sort of asked to focus on the sort of topic that you can see on your screen now. Responsible is reliable, which is sort of turned into our main selling point over the past 18 months, I would say. This is sort of something that we came up on the occasion of the first IEA Critical Mineral Summit last September, but I'll get back to that. Really the point and the purpose of the presentation is to emphasize the need to invest in governance, I would say, in the broadest possible sense of the term, to actually make the future production and trade of those critical minerals resources more reliable. And ultimately, the idea is that it would benefit everyone, so in all countries. So I'll get started with a couple of slides on our work, and I hope it's in full screen and everything. I can't see that. It's great, fantastic. So I'm guessing a number of you are familiar with this. Just wanted to further to take this occasion to emphasize a couple of points. It's a very long document with a very long title, but it aims to be doing two things primarily. From a technical standpoint, help. It says gold, but it's not gold. I should have updated that. It helps companies integrate into their management systems due diligence processes that will help them map their supply chains, identify potentially the provenance of their mineral resources, collect information on companies in those supply chains, run risk assessments, and develop mitigation strategies that ultimately will help them remain engaged in those supply chains. And I think that's a key point for our conversation today. This guidance is now almost 15 years old, and that's the second point. Its aim has always been to promote responsible investment in conflict affected and high risk areas. At that point in time, so 15 years ago, and sadly it's still very much relevant, but the idea was that through investment and responsible investment in the extractive sector in those areas, companies and stakeholders had a way to actually influence the political situation in those countries and invest money and make sure that the extractive sector could turn into a stabilization factor for those conflict affected and high risk areas. The original area of implementation was the Great Lakes regions of Africa, and we're still very much involved in there. But I find it really interesting 15 years further down the line to actually see that this objective, the strategic objective, is extremely relevant for today's conversation. Meaning that, and I'll get back to that, we all know that a number of those CRM are located in, let's just call them high-risk jurisdiction. Sadly, it's probably going to be increasingly the case. So what companies need at this point in time is guidance to help them navigate those complex environments and remain engaged so that they know that they can invest millions of dollars or euros and not be threatened by the prospect of having to leave out the country or the jurisdiction as soon as they identify any sort of risk. But I'll come back to that. Very quickly, it applies to all mineral resources. It applies globally, and it applies those recommendations to all companies in the supply chain, which means that we're working with small, medium, large mining companies, then trading companies, refining companies, processing companies, downstream trading companies, and then ultimately any sort of downstream producer, be they automotive manufacturers or tech, or increasingly other parts of the economy. But those recommendations are for companies to implement, which means that most of our work entails helping companies and industry association make sense of our recommendations and implement them practically. And that's obviously when the rubber hits the road and the most interesting conversation take place. I think over the past 15 years, we've been able to develop solid relations, trust relations with companies, and in return, they kindly share with us their practical challenges making our job very interesting because we're actually here to help them implement those recommendations and ultimately ensure that they have some form of impact. That's a lot of pictures. I was talking about the minerals guidance, which is at the center of your document. I should have said earlier on what it aims to do is help companies first prioritize identifications of risks related to conflict financing, serious abuses of human rights, and serious economic crimes. So corruption, bribery, tax evasion, money laundering, terrorist finance. But by no means does it instruct companies to stop there. It's always been very clear that they're supposed to be looking for additional risks, and in particular environmental risk. Reason why we have developed the handbook that you see there, with the support of the German Federal Agency for Environment, and it's now widely available. And basically what it does is take the due diligence journey a step further, providing detailed information on the nature of risk that companies, in particular downstream companies, should be looking for in their supply chain of critical or other mineral resources. The other types of documents on your left, the guidelines for multinational enterprises and due diligence guidance for RBC are sort of the overarching recommendations for business. So they're sector agnostic. The rest is really specific to the mining sector in particular, extractive sector in general for the stakeholder engagement guide. And over the years, we have actually developed a number of small practical documents that any company can actually use to better understand what we are asking on a specific set of issues. So corruption, child labor, we have one on artisanal and small-scale mining. We have now this environmental due diligence handbook. So as I just explained, this is what the handbook entails to do. It is a rather short and hopefully handy document. It's accessible on our website, so please do pay attention. But again, gives me the opportunity to clarify once more that by no means did we ever intend to send a signal that the only thing that matters is conflict financing and serious abuse of human rights. It's much more complex than that. It's actually so complex that detecting environmental risks may actually take you to the identification of corruption risk and serious human rights abuses risks. All those risks at some point end up being connected. And the idea of due diligence and the methodology behind it is that step by step, you actually collect information and use your brain and try to understand if that's actually an indication of risk. And if it is the case, what is it that I can do as a responsible company? Am I allowed to remain engaged in this specific environment? And if so, how? And that's what makes the work so interesting. Some drivers, I won't elaborate too much on that. But the OECD standard is a voluntary guidance, as you know, but it's been turned into mandatory requirements quite a lot, either by industry associations and market makers like the London Metal Exchange or the LBMA and others, but increasingly as well by regulators. So in the US, in the EU, in the UAE, in the case of gold, well, that was quite an achievement because it really demonstrates that this instrument is not intended to be used only by OECD countries. But all in all now, we have about 15 global supply chain of mineral resources that have or will soon embrace OECD due diligence approaches, and they're listed here. And this is because of, again, mandatory requirements, either dictated by market makers and or by governments. The most recent one, obviously, is the EU battery regulation, which covers lithium, natural graphite, cobalt, and nickel. We had cobalt and nickel already sort of covered through the LME, but we've now sort of added two, and more are in the pipeline. We're working a lot with Mica, as Sarah and Ludivine know. So yeah, the list keeps on expanding, which is very encouraging. Also interesting to note that we do have some serious cooperation with Chinese stakeholders. It's obviously always very difficult to pretend that all Chinese companies pay an interest in those issues, but there are some real meaningful, serious conversations going on with a number of Chinese companies throughout the supply chain, from mining to trading to end users and downstream companies. Turning to critical and transition minerals, as we like to call them, just a note on that, we're trying to refrain from the critical mineral terminology, which carries a heavy sort of a burden. Producing countries don't like that terminology, and we also agree that it doesn't help with making the conversation easier. What's critical may be automatically linked to national sovereign interests. And of course, when our intention is to make sure that everyone gets its share of the pie, when you address and you tackle that conversation through the critical minerals terminology, the conversation is not beginning in a nice way. So we'd rather use transition minerals. That's quite a heavy slide, but this is taken out of our briefing notes that we produced, as I said, in September, called Responsible is Reliable. And basically the idea here is, and sorry, cut me if I'm getting too long, but the idea is really to emphasize as much as we can that investing in governance at large is a factor of security of supply. There is obviously a lot of interest from a number of stakeholders, including some of our own countries, to cut some corners and take out what some of policymakers tend to call red tapes. We strongly believe that this is a mistake that might help you access deposit in the short term, but in the medium to long term, you're creating a big risk to your production pipeline. Because honestly, if you invest in a country where corruption is rife and there's absolutely zero social license to operate, and you have non-state armed groups running around the country, and you don't do anything about it, it will come back and bite you at some point. So this is what we've tried to really emphasize in this document. The other thing that we are constantly insisting on, and I already flagged and alluded to, is what you'll see here as called as the de-risking conundrum. Basically, because of those increasingly demanding ESG ambitions that you would find in a number of policymakers' pledge, let's say, companies are actually reluctant to consider investing in complex jurisdiction, but that's not going to work for anyone. So what we always say is that it's really important to have very strong ESG ambitions and objectives, but what matters most is your roadmap to get there and clear guidance for companies on how they can navigate complex environments, which is what the OECD instruments and other provide. But what we're seeing quite a lot at the moment, unfortunately, is companies just saying, "Oh, this is really too complex. I can't be involved in that kind of jurisdiction." You may have seen what the government of the DRC has been doing recently with a company in the US. That's not helping from our perspective, getting the kind of conversation that we all need. And there's other examples of that have been developing. So that's an issue. We all need to agree, that more investment is needed. More investment is needed in high-risk jurisdiction, and the conditions for those investments need to be laid out clearly, and they are to some extent, but they need to be well understood by everyone in the supply chain as well as in the broader ecosystem of mining, of the mining industry, and that means reaching out to investors and banks and financiers. Those are the conditions that would help us open up mining jurisdiction, open up new mines in the right conditions, and secure a reliable supply of those resources in the coming decades. So this little figure is just an example of how what people think are local issues can very quickly turn into domestic-wide issues, and these are sort of taken from real life examples. So an issue at a local mine site can actually escalate and turn into a debate in the National Assembly or Parliament, that it ends up blocking every processing of mining license for an undetermined period of time. That's a very clear example of how things can go wrong for everyone. Corruption is probably one of the most overlooked risk in mineral supply chains at the moment. Everyone knows it's there, everyone knows it's big, but everyone is just limiting its efforts to some extent to what is legally required of them, and that's already very good. But that's not sufficient, which explains why we've developed this frequently asked question document available on our website, which basically pushes companies downstream to do their best efforts to identify corruption risk deep down in their supply chain and come together to find solutions. Every single big mining company that we talk to flag this corruption risk as a major impediment and a major obstacle to considering investment in a number of high-risk jurisdictions. And we fully agree with that because it makes everything riskier. And also, corruption is often identified as a sort of victimless crime by a number of stakeholders. Everyone seems to believe that it's okay to go through corruption, but at the end of the day, it is corruption that empties state coffers, and that leaves those countries in a state of systemic poverty and leads people then to pick up their shovels and turn into artisanal miners and then encroach on large-scale mining concessions and driving insecurity, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a sort of vicious circle that may start with a big corruption case that at the moment companies, policymakers, and the broader, again, ecosystem tends to be overlooking to some extent. So we really constantly heavily emphasize this in our interventions. I will stop with a last slide, just flagging our upcoming annual conference taking place in Paris the week of 21 May. We'll have 2 days of plenary sessions, 22 and 23rd, but partner session throughout the week. We have, I think, 60 to 70 now, covering all the supply chains that I detailed earlier, potentially others as well. So some of the topics that we'll discuss, I mean, the opening sequence will be looking at government-to-government partnerships, basically trying to make sense of what I just laid out. How do you leverage those partnerships to make sure that responsible sourcing becomes an integral part of the conversation? A session on responsible finance, another on security, which is something that I failed to emphasize, but local security at mine sites is another key point of social license to operate. One session that I'm really happy that we were able to put there is responsible sand and silicates, because it's simply massive, and it's the natural resource that will be the most exploited in the future, actually, to build all the kinds of infrastructure that we all need. We'll have a specific focus on Myanmar this time, and coming back to gold, which remains one of our key points of concern, specific emphasis on illicit trade risks in gold supply chains in Latin America. So you have the registration link here there with all logistical information. It's free of charge, and the more the merrier. So you're all warmly invited to come to Paris and stay with us for the week. Thank you very much.
Louis, thank you so much. Round of applause, everybody, for Louis Maréchal from the OECD. Fantastic. Now, Louis, you managed to invite all of us to Paris. I don't think any of us are going to say no if we can possibly make it there. And that list of topics that you've got look absolutely fantastic. We've got time just for one quick question, and that is around, okay, so we're hearing a lot about that governance and transparency, be it at the kind of the front end of the supply chain, so where we're looking for those rocks, where we're digging them out of the ground. When those materials then go off into the kind of more complicated processing, and then off they go into things like cars and phones, etc., that middle bit of the value chain, do you feel there's enough transparency in it, or can we do better in that area?
Well, the issue is that I think there's a number of middles, and that's what makes it more complicated. Our standard calls for an independent third-party audit to take place at the control point of the supply chain, as we call it. Let's say the physical control point. Usually it's the refiner or the smelter, and that's working quite well. But obviously, over the years and through experience, we've learned that there's actually other kind of stakeholders and actors that play a critical role in supply chains, in particular those global commodity traders. Some of them are playing the game, some others are not. So that's probably one of the biggest challenge at the moment, and sort of making sure that global commodity traders, either big or small, show up at the table and make their best efforts also to increase transparency. Transparency in global commodity trading is not necessarily an obvious thing to discuss, but it can work. And we've had some very positive example with a couple of them. So if I had to pick up one part of the supply chain that I think we need to focus our efforts on, that would be commodity trading.
Yeah, I think many of us who are dialing in at the moment are very keen to hear more about that area as well. So with that, thank you very, very much, Louis. And hopefully lots of us will see you in Paris, which would be great. Round of applause.
Hope so. Thank you.
Thank you.